In late May of 1942, the United States Navy had 3 aircraft carriers left in the entire Pacific Ocean. One of them was broken. The men at Pearl Harbor said she needed 3 months in dry dock to fight again. Admiral Chester Nimitz gave them 72 hours. This is the story of why he made that choice, and what it cost the men who carried it out. Pearl Harbor, May 27, 1942, late afternoon. The water in the channel was flat and oily, reflecting a sky bruised with smoke. Workers along the docks stopped what they were doing. Welders lifted their masks. A signal officer let his binoculars fall to his chest. She was coming in. USS Yorktown, hull number CV5, limped past the harbor entrance with a thick black ribbon of fuel oil trailing behind her for 10 miles out to sea. Her flight deck was scarred. Her hull plating was buckled near the waterline. Smoke still curled faintly from a vent near the stern. She rode lower in the water than a carrier should. To anyone who knew ships, she looked like she should be dead. She wasn't. On her bridge, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, 53 years old, gripped the rail and watched the familiar coastline of Oahu slide past. He hadn't slept properly in 19 days. His uniform was creased and stained with smoke. His ship had crossed the Pacific from the Coral Sea on faith and good engineering, and now she was home. He should have felt relief. He didn't. Buckmaster knew exactly what was in the cable traffic. He knew what the code breakers were saying. He knew what was coming. And he knew that whatever rest he was about to get would not last. On the pier, a man in Admiral's whites stood without speaking. Chester W. Nimitz, 57, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, did not wave, did not smile. He watched Yorktown approach with a stillness that some of his officers had learned to read as anger and others had learned to read as nothing at all. Nimitz rarely raised his voice. He had a deep German Texan calm that came from a hill country boyhood and 4 decades in the Navy. He weighed lives the way other men weighed coins, carefully, quietly, without flinching. What Nimitz was about to do was the kind of thing officers do once in a career, and only if they are very lucky and very prepared to lose everything. He was about to gamble the Pacific. 19 days earlier, on the morning of May 8, 1942, the Yorktown had been sailing through the Coral Sea, 1,200 miles northeast of Australia. Her crew had already been at battle stations for 36 hours. They had just made history. The Coral Sea was the first naval battle in human warfare in which the opposing ships never saw each other. No broadsides, no close gunnery, just aircraft, hundreds of them, launched across hundreds of miles of water, hunting carriers they could only locate by guess and intuition and the occasional desperate radio bearing. 2 American carriers had been engaged, Yorktown and her sister ship USS Lexington. 2 Japanese carriers had come hunting them, Shokaku and Zuikaku. By the second morning, Shokaku was crippled. Zuikaku had lost most of her air crews. Lexington was on fire. And then at 11:10, a Japanese dive bomber broke through the clouds above Yorktown. The pilot released a single semi-armor-piercing bomb at the bottom of his dive from about 2,000 feet. It struck the flight deck just behind the island, punched through 4 decks, and detonated near a storeroom adjacent to a forward boiler space. 40 men died in the blast. 26 more were wounded. Yorktown stayed afloat, but she was hurt in ways that could not be patched in the middle of an ocean. Frames in her boiler rooms had been heat-warped. Her speed had dropped. She was running on partial systems. Her crew worked through smoke for 2 days just to keep her moving. Lexington was not so lucky. Hours after the attack, vapors from ruptured fuel lines reached an electrical generator. The explosion that followed tore her open from the inside. By nightfall, the destroyer USS Phelps had put torpedoes into her hull to send her down. Lexington took 216 of her men to the bottom. The Americans had 2 carriers left in the South Pacific. Then one, 2,000 miles to the north, in a windowless basement under an administration building at Pearl Harbor, a man in a red velvet smoking jacket and carpet slippers was reading Japan's mind. His name was Joseph Rochefort. He was 42 years old. He commanded a unit called Station Hippo, and almost no one outside that basement knew he existed. Rochefort was not a polished officer. He had begun his career as an enlisted sailor and worked his way up. He spoke Japanese. He read Japanese. He thought in patterns the way a chess master thinks in positions. His team worked 6-hour shifts in a room thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. Most of them slept under their desks. They went home only to bathe and change. Some of them stopped going home altogether. By late May 1942, Rochefort and his cryptanalyst had broken roughly 90% of the Imperial Japanese Navy's main fleet code, known to them as JN-25. They could read fragments of orders, ship movements, supply requests, weather reports, and they had begun to see something terrible. Japan was preparing the largest naval operation of the war. Hundreds of ships, multiple task forces. A diversionary strike to the north, a main strike somewhere central. The code groups kept naming a place. They kept calling it AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny ring of coral about 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. Midway was a U.S. forward base. It controlled a strip of ocean. Taking it would push the American defensive perimeter back by 1,000 miles. From Midway, Japanese bombers could threaten Hawaii itself. But Washington didn't believe him. This was the first crack in a story almost no one outside the Navy knew. The intelligence community in Washington, particularly the office known as OP-20G, did not trust the analysts at Pearl Harbor. They believed the Japanese target was the Aleutian Islands, off Alaska. Some thought it might even be the west coast of the United States. They were respectable men with respectable arguments. And they were wrong. Rochefort had to prove it. His team chose a trick so simple that it should not have worked. Midway, they noted, had a freshwater distillation plant. If they sent a fake radio message in plain English, uncoded, saying that Midway's distillation plant had broken down and that the garrison was short on fresh water, Japanese listening posts would intercept it. Then Japan's own internal communications would mention the shortage when they reported on the upcoming target, and those reports would be encoded in JN-25, which Rochefort could read. Rochefort took the idea to Nimitz. Nimitz authorized the message. A short time later, Rochefort's team intercepted a Japanese transmission noting that the target, AF, was experiencing problems with its fresh water supply. It was one of the cleanest pieces of intelligence work in the war. Now Nimitz knew where Japan was going. He knew approximately when, he knew with what, and he knew what he had to fight them with. It wasn't enough. By the last week of May 1942, the United States Pacific Fleet had 3 operational aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the wreck called Yorktown that had just dragged herself into harbor on partial power. Japan was sending 4 frontline fleet carriers to Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 55 years old, the same man who had led the carrier strike on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Behind them, in a separate formation, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, 58, commanded battleships and cruisers in a column larger than anything the United States could put to sea. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard. He spoke English. Before the war, he had argued in writing that Japan could not win a long fight against America. He intended to make sure this fight did not become long. Nimitz looked at the math. 3 carriers against 4, and one of his 3 could barely steam. He walked down to the dry dock. Yorktown was in dry dock number 1. The water had been pumped out faster than any docking in Pearl Harbor history, a feat of its own, accomplished by overriding standard pump procedures. Nimitz waded through the last of the water on the dock floor in dress shoes. He was followed by a small group of officers and engineers, the most senior of whom was Captain Claude S. Gillette, industrial manager of the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. Gillette had already inspected the damage. His written estimate was on Nimitz's desk that morning. At least 90 days, possibly longer, for a complete overhaul back to full fleet condition. That was how long Gillette had calculated it would take under standard Navy repair protocol. 90 days of careful work, new frames where the structure was bent, new bulkheads where the fires had warped them, patching along the buckled hull, full boiler reconditioning, a thorough purge of fuel oil contamination. A proper job. Nimitz looked up at the underside of Yorktown's hull. He looked at the hole the bomb had made. He looked at the engineers waiting for his orders. He said, "We must have this ship back in 3 days." There was silence on the dry dock floor. Gillette finally spoke. He told the admiral, respectfully, that there was no Navy regulation, no industrial standard, and no precedent that allowed for what he was being asked to do. Nimitz answered him in the flat hill country voice the staff had learned to recognize, then forget the standard. Outside the dry dock, the second piece of the gamble was already collapsing. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, 59, the most aggressive carrier commander in the United States Navy, had returned from operations in the South Pacific with a skin condition so severe that doctors at the Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital could no longer ignore it. The condition was a violent allergic dermatitis. His body was covered in raw patches. He could not wear his uniform without pain. He could not sleep. On May 26, Halsey was admitted to the hospital and removed from operational command. He had been supposed to lead the American carriers at Midway. Nimitz visited him. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Halsey was furious. He had spent his career preparing for a moment like this one. And now, with the most important battle of the war approaching, he could not put on a shirt without bleeding. Nimitz asked him who should take his place. Halsey did not hesitate. He recommended Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, 55 years old, the commander of his cruiser screen. This recommendation, taken on its own, was strange. Spruance was not a carrier officer. He had spent his career on cruisers and battleships. He had never commanded a carrier task force in combat. He did not fly. He did not particularly understand the temperament of carrier pilots, who tended to view non-aviators with polite contempt. Spruance was quiet, methodical, slightly built. He read books in his cabin and walked the deck for hours each evening. He gave the impression of a college professor in a Navy uniform. He was, by every conventional measure, the wrong man. Halsey told Nimitz to put him in command of Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet anyway. Nimitz agreed. That night, in the office of the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, the entire architecture of the coming battle was sitting on the edge of failure. Yorktown was on blocks in a dry dock, with workers crawling over her by the hundreds, trying to do in 3 days what should have taken 3 months. Her air group, exhausted from Coral Sea, was being reorganized on the fly. Some of her aviators were missing, some were dead. A replacement bombing squadron, VB-3, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, 41 years old, being flown Ephine from the carrier Saratoga, which was still on the west coast, finishing her own repairs after a torpedo hit earlier in the year. In Task Force 16, the most famous fighting admiral in the fleet was lying in a hospital bed, unable to wear his own shirt. A cruiser officer with no carrier combat experience was going to lead 2 carriers into the largest naval battle in the Pacific. In a basement 200 yards from the harbor, a lieutenant commander in carpet slippers was telling Nimitz the exact date Japan would arrive, the first week of June, and was being doubted by his own service in Washington. Across the water, Yamamoto was sailing east in his flagship Yamato with tens of thousands of sailors and the conviction that the Americans had only 2 carriers left in the Pacific. He was wrong about that, but not by much. In dry dock number 1, somewhere under the curve of Yorktown's bent hull, a welder named no one in the official record lit his torch and began to work. Around him, hundreds of other men were doing the same thing. They had 3 days. They had been told that the Navy regulations did not apply to what they were about to do. They had been told to forget the standard. They had not been told why, but Buckmaster knew, Gillette knew, Nimitz knew. The broken carrier on the blocks above them was not being repaired to survive the war. She was being repaired to survive one battle. And one battle was the only thing standing between the United States and the loss of the Pacific. The first night in dry dock number 1 belonged to the welders. By sundown on May 27, 1942, 1,400 shipyard workers had begun the impossible. They moved across Yorktown's hull in shifts that rotated every 8 hours and never stopped. Welders, burners, riggers, pipefitters, boilermakers, electricians. Most of them were civilians. Most of them were too old or too young for combat. None of them had been told what was at stake. They did not need to be told. They could see the bomb hole. They could see the smoke smell still in the wood. They knew what kind of fight Yorktown was going back into. Captain Claude S. Gillette walked the dock floor in his shirt sleeves. He was around 50 years old, the industrial manager of the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, and he had been given an order that should not have been possible to carry out. 3 days. He had told the admiral it could not be done. The admiral had told him to forget the standard. So Gillette forgot the standard. He authorized work that no peacetime inspector would have signed. He authorized things he would not put in writing. Welds laid down hot over warped frames, plating bent back into approximate shape with sledgehammers. Compartments that should have been opened and dried and inspected were sealed shut from the outside and left for someone else's war. Up on the flight deck, Captain Elliot Buckmaster did not leave the ship. He slept in his sea cabin, ate in his sea cabin, and walked his ship every 2 hours, day and night. Below his feet, men were hammering on the keel of his command in a way that no naval officer of his generation had ever seen done before. He did not ask them to stop. He did not ask them to slow down. He stood at the rail of the flight deck in the early morning hours and watched the showers of sparks spilling out of Yorktown's flanks like a steel mill at full burn. He understood what was being done to his ship. He had been told to take her back to sea. By the second night, the dry dock floor was an industrial war zone of its own kind. Compressed air lines crisscrossed the bottom. Acetylene torches burned at every hour. Engines were lifted out and lowered back in by floating cranes. Sailors who had survived Coral Sea slept on cots in their own berthing compartments, while shipyard workers cut and welded above them. They had been told not to evacuate the ship. There was no time. Some of the workers slept on the dock when they slept at all. Some did not sleep. Meals were brought to them where they stood. Coffee was carried in 5-gallon cans. The lights stayed on all night, every night. This was not repair. This was triage on the body of a carrier. It was field surgery on a ship. By the third morning, May 29, Yorktown was floated out of the dry dock and tied alongside a pier. The work continued there, around the clock, with civilian and Navy personnel still climbing in and out of her with welding leads and tool bags. Her boilers were being fired one by one. Her steering was checked. Her elevators were tested. Aircraft were being craned aboard in batches. She was not a finished ship. She was a ship that had been told there was no more time. While she was being patched, 2,000 miles to the west, the largest war fleet in the history of the Pacific was sailing toward her. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato. He was 58 years old. He had 2 fingers missing from his left hand, lost at the Battle of Tsushima nearly 4 decades earlier. He had studied at Harvard. He had spent his life as a believer in naval aviation in a navy still dominated by battleship admirals. He had argued, before the war began, that Japan could not win a long fight against the United States. He had been ordered to plan one anyway, so he had planned one to end quickly. Yamamoto was sailing east at the head of more than 160 warships, divided into 4 major formations scattered across the North Pacific in an arc more than 1,000 miles wide. He had a carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. He had an invasion convoy of troop transports protected by cruisers. He had a diversionary force striking far to the north toward the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. And he had his own main body of battleships, including Yamato, the largest warship in the world, trailing well behind to deliver a final blow against whatever American fleet came out to challenge him. The plan was elegant. The plan was layered. The plan assumed surprise. It assumed that the Americans did not know where he was going. It assumed that Yorktown, hit by a bomb at the Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier, was either at the bottom of the ocean or in a shipyard, useless. Japanese naval intelligence had reported her sinking. Yamamoto had no reason to doubt them. And here was the strange weight of his arrangement, the thing he could not see from the bridge of Yamato. Every formation in his plan was sailing alone. Hundreds of miles separated them. They could not reinforce one another. They could not see one another. They were each, in their own piece of ocean, a fleet of one. It was a brilliant deception aimed at an enemy who could not see him. But the Americans could see him. Rochefort had been reading him for weeks. The deception was aimed at nothing. The carrier force at the front of the spear was alone, exposed, and about to be ambushed by an enemy that knew exactly when and where it would arrive. On the morning of May 30, 1942, Yorktown cast off her lines and steamed out of Pearl Harbor. There were still shipyard workers on her decks. Some of them had not finished. They went to sea with her. Aircraft were being craned aboard while she gained way down the channel. Her flight deck still smelled of fresh welding. Smoke from her stacks was the thin, clean smoke of new boilers being broken in too fast. Her hull was patched, not repaired. Her watertight integrity was approximate. Her speed had been restored to roughly 28 knots, which was good enough. 3 of her 9 boilers remained out of action. There had simply been no time to repair them all. She did not need to be perfect. She needed to be present. She was the 3rd American carrier going to Midway. On the bridge, Buckmaster ordered the helm to come around. Yorktown turned her bow into the open Pacific. Behind her, the harbor crews stood at the dockside and watched her go, and most of them were not told until weeks later where she had gone or what she had done. 3 days later, on the morning of June 2, 1942, Yorktown rendezvoused with USS Enterprise and USS Hornet at a point in the open ocean that Nimitz himself had marked on the chart and named Point Luck. The name was not a joke. He had named it that on purpose. It was just outside the search radius of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft and almost exactly where Rochefort's codebreakers said the Japanese strike force would pass. On Yorktown, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, 57, raised his flag. Fletcher commanded Task Force 17. He had been at the Coral Sea. He was cautious, deliberate, and not loved by the press, which had begun to whisper that he was too slow. He was the senior officer present, which meant he was in overall tactical command. On Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, 55, took his place on the flag bridge of a carrier for the first time in his career. He was a cruiser officer. He had never run a carrier task force in combat. He was wearing borrowed staff, Halsey's staff, men who had never reported to him before, who flew aircraft he did not fly, who spoke a tactical language he had not been raised in. He carried it well. He did not pretend to know what he did not know. He let his air officers run the air war. He listened more than he spoke. The men around him would later say that what surprised them most about Spruance was his calm. Yorktown took her place to the east. Enterprise and Hornet held their station to the west. 3 carriers waited in the empty ocean for an enemy who did not know they were there. It was the first hours of June 4 when the world began to move. A PBY Catalina patrol plane out of Midway, flying low over a flat dawn sea, broke radio silence with a contact report. Many planes heading toward Midway. Then a second report. 2 battleships. Course 135, speed 25. Nagumo had been found. On the bridge of Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Naigumo received the news with the controlled silence of a man who had not slept enough. He had launched a strike against Midway itself that morning, intending to soften the atoll for invasion. His pilots had reported the strike was successful, but a second strike was needed to finish the job. He ordered his second wave armed with land attack bombs. They were brought up from below and parked on the hangar decks, where mechanics began to swap out the torpedoes already loaded under the aircraft. Then the report came in. There was an American carrier, northeast, hidden in the ocean. Nobody had told him about an American carrier. Nagumo froze. Then he ordered his torpedoes put back on. Half-armed bombs sat on the hangar decks of his carriers. Ground crews tore them loose with cranes and rolling carts, racing to reload the torpedoes they had only just removed. Aviation gasoline lines ran out across the decks. Fuel hoses lay open. The carriers were doing what no carrier ever wants to do in combat. They were running with their guts on the floor. And the first American attack was already in the air. It came from Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 8, 15 old Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and lumbering and obsolete. Commanded by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, 41 years old, part Sioux on his mother's side, raised in South Dakota, a man so committed to his pilots that he had written each of them a personal letter the night before, telling them that whatever happened, he believed they would do their duty. Waldron had separated from the rest of Hornet's air group because he believed the navigators had it wrong. He had turned south. He had been right. He found Nagumo. He had no fighter escort. The Wildcats meant to protect him had lost contact and never found the enemy at all. Waldron led his 15 planes down to the deck and started his run. The Japanese combat air patrol came down on them like falling stone. 0 fighters, the best carrier fighters in the world at that hour, tore VT-8 apart plane by plane, one after another. The Devastators flew straight ahead and pressed the attack and were chopped out of the sky. Every aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 was shot down. Of the 30 men aboard those 15 planes, one survived. Ensign George H. Gay, 25 years old, ditched his burning aircraft into the sea, climbed out, hid under his seat cushion to avoid being strafed, and watched the rest of the battle from the surface of the ocean. What he saw was the most decisive 10 minutes of the Pacific War, because Torpedo Squadron 8, dying in the salt water below, had pulled every Japanese Zero down to wave-top altitude. The combat air patrol had spent its altitude and its fuel-hunting torpedo planes. Then the next torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and from Yorktown arrived and were also slaughtered, and the Zeros stayed low to finish them off. Far above all of it, unseen, unopposed, the American dive bombers were arriving. The man who arrived first was Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, 40 years old, leading the dive bombers of the Enterprise Air Group. He had been searching for nearly 2 hours. His planes were low on fuel. He had reached the point where he should have turned for home, with nothing to show for it. The mission was going to fail. Then he saw a wake on the ocean. It was a single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, steaming flat out to the northeast. McCluskey understood immediately that the destroyer had been left behind by a hunting depth charge run on an American submarine and was now racing to catch up with the carrier force. McCluskey did the thing that ended the war. He turned his planes and followed the wake. Minutes later, at 10:25 in the morning, he was overhead the Japanese carriers. The dive bombers came out of the sun. From Enterprise, 2 squadrons under McCluskey pushed over on Akagi and Kaga. From Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell F. Leslie, 41 years old, commander of VB-3, the squadron that had been flown late from Saratoga, pushed over on Soryu. 3 bombing squadrons, attacking 3 carriers, at the same moment with no fighter opposition, against decks loaded with armed aircraft and exposed ordnance and open fuel lines. 6 minutes, that was how long it took. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, 3 burning. All flagship Akagi was hit by a bomb that fell near an open elevator and exploded amid armed and fueled aircraft. The chain reaction tore her apart from within. Nagumo had to be talked off the bridge by his staff. He left his own flagship with tears on his face. 3 Japanese carriers had been killed in the time it takes to brush your teeth. But the 4th carrier, Hiryu, had not been hit, and the man in command of Hiryu's division was not going to wait. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, 49 years old, was the most aggressive carrier officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had studied at Princeton. He spoke English. He was loud and quick, where Nagumo had been cautious and slow. Within an hour of the catastrophe, Hiryu was launching her own strike. Her pilots took off knowing their fleet was finished. They flew east, found the smoke trail of an American carrier, and pressed the attack. The carrier they found was Yorktown. At about noon on June 4, 3 Japanese bombs struck Yorktown's flight deck within minutes of one another. Fires bloomed across her after end. One bomb burst inside an uptake from the boilers and choked all but one of her fire rooms. Her speed dropped. Her smoke went black. To any pilot watching from above, she looked like a carrier dying. She did not die. Her damage control parties had survived this once before. They were the same crew who had limped Yorktown back to Pearl Harbor from the Coral Sea. They knew exactly what to do. They put out the fires in roughly an hour. They patched the flight deck with timber and steel plate. They restored boilers. They got her moving again. The black smoke was replaced by a clean white plume. Her speed steadied. Her colors flew. Later that afternoon, Hiryu launched her second strike, this time with torpedo bombers. The Japanese pilots found the same carrier still underway, with clean white smoke and a steady course. Some of them reportedly believed they were attacking a different, undamaged American carrier altogether. They were wrong. They were attacking Yorktown again. Yorktown's fighters rose to meet them. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thack, 37 years old, leading Fighting Squadron 3, had spent the months before the battle developing a new tactic he called the beam defense position. It would later be remembered by the men who flew it by another name. They called it the Thack's Weave. Two fighters flying parallel courses, crossing back and forth, each able to clear the other's tail with a quick burst. Thack had practiced it on the deck of his cabin with matchsticks. Over the Pacific that afternoon, he and his wingmen flew it for real. Outnumbered by Zeros, outclimbed by Zeros, outturned by Zeros. They held the formation and weaved and shot Zeros off one another's tails until the surviving Japanese pilots broke off and headed for the torpedo run. The torpedoes that got through were enough. Two of them struck Yorktown's port side amidships. The detonations broke her against herself. Her boilers lost steam. The list began. She heeled over to port, 15 degrees, then 20, then 26. On the bridge, Captain Buckmaster watched the inclinometer in silence. He had stood on this same bridge through the bomb at Coral Sea. He had crossed the Pacific on faith. He had brought her back to fight at Midway. He had taken 3 bombs and held her together long enough to make Yamaguchi's pilots think she was already dead. Now she was dying for real. At 14:55 on the afternoon of June 4, 1942, Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. He gave it quietly. He did not raise his voice. The crew of USS Yorktown left her in order, one section at a time, into the destroyers waiting below. The wounded went first. There was no panic on her decks. There was no shouting. Some of the men paused at the rail to look back at her one more time. Most did not. They had been through this before, at the Coral Sea, when they had not had to leave her. This time they had to leave her. The last man down the line, by tradition and by his own insistence, was Buckmaster himself. He walked the length of the listing deck. He checked every compartment he could reach. Then he stepped over the side and let himself down into the water by a knotted line. The line was knotted because the ship had been listing too far to use a ladder. Behind him on her empty bridge, Yorktown drifted with no power, no helm, and a fire still burning somewhere below. She was not yet finished, not quite, and neither, in the grey light of late afternoon, was battle. The Hiryu had less than 24 hours to live. By late afternoon on June 4, while Yorktown's crew was still climbing into destroyers under the gathering dusk, the dive bombers of Enterprise found her. They came in groups from the high angle of the western sun, with no Japanese fighters left aloft to stop them. 4 bombs struck Hiryu's forward flight deck. The blast lifted her elevator and stood it on end against her bridge structure like a torn metal flag. Her fires would not go out. By midnight, she was dead in the water. By the small hours of June 5, her engineers were ordered topside. Her surviving crew were transferred to escorting destroyers. The fires below were beyond all reach. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi did not leave. He had ordered the abandoned ship. He had thanked his crew. He stood with the ship's captain, Captain Tomeo Kaku, on the wing of the burning bridge as the destroyers came in to take the men off. He gave his white cap to a junior officer to keep. He did not weep. He did not write a letter. He did what the senior carrier officers of his service in his generation did when their ship was lost on their watch. He stayed. In the early morning of June 5, the destroyer Makigumo put torpedoes into Hiryu's side. She did not go down at once. She drifted, burning, through the morning. Sometime after 9 o'clock, she rolled to port and slid under, taking Yamaguchi and Kaku with her along with several hundred of her sailors who had not been able to get out from below. In a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 frontline aircraft carriers and most of its irreplaceable naval aviators. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the same 4 ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months before. The strike force that had opened the war was now lying in the same ocean. The American carriers had taken 1 wound between them. That wound was still afloat. Through the morning of June 5 and through all of June 6, USS Yorktown drifted at the latitude where her crew had abandoned her. Her list was bad but stable. Her smoke had thinned to nothing. From the air she looked like exactly what she was, a wounded ship that might still be saved. Captain Elliot Buckmaster believed she could be. On the morning of June 6, he led a salvage party of roughly 170 volunteers back across the water and up the lines onto his own ship. They came in tugs and destroyers. They brought pumps. They brought hoses. They began the slow work of fighting her list, jettisoning weight from her high side, restoring power. The destroyer USS Hammond pulled alongside Yorktown's starboard quarter and made fast to her. From Hammond's deck, cables and hoses ran across the gap, feeding electricity and water back into the dying carrier. The 2 ships became, for the day, one body. A Japanese submarine had been watching them for several hours. The submarine was I-168. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe. He was 36 years old. He had been ordered 2 days earlier by Combined Fleet Command to find Yorktown and finish her. He had threaded his boat through hundreds of miles of open ocean to reach her position. Now he had her. He also had a problem. American destroyers were screening her in a wide ring. The water around Yorktown was being patrolled at slow speed by men listening on hydrophones for any submarine foolish enough to come close. Tanabe came close anyway. He worked his submarine inside the ring. He took risks no peacetime submariner would take. He ran at periscope depth between escorts. He went deep and waited and came back up. At 1336 in the afternoon on June 6, he had Yorktown lined up in his crosshairs from inside 1,500 yards. He fired 4 torpedoes. The first ran wide. The second struck Hammond amidships and broke her in half. The third and fourth ran under what was left of Hammond and struck Yorktown. Hammond sank in less than 4 minutes. As she went down, her own depth charges detonated below the surface. The blast killed of the men who had jumped clear and were swimming for safety. By the end of the engagement, roughly 80 of her sailors were dead. Yorktown took her last 2 wounds without a sound. The salvage party was forced off. They scrambled down the lines into the boats and pulled away. The list, which they had been slowly correcting all morning, began to deepen again as the new flooding worked through her. She drifted for the rest of the day. She drifted into the night. At about 5 in the morning on June 7, 1942, in the grey light before sunrise, USS Yorktown rolled onto her port side and slid under. Her colors were still flying when the water closed over her flight deck. She fell more than 3 miles to the bottom of the Pacific and came to rest there. She would not be seen again by human eyes for more than 50 years. When the after-action reports were tallied, the United States Navy had lost 1 aircraft carrier, 1 destroyer, about 150 aircraft, and 362 men in the battle and in the actions immediately around it. Yorktown's own toll for the campaign came to 141 of her sailors and her aviators. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 frontline fleet carriers, the heavy cruiser Mikuma, more than 240 aircraft, and roughly 3,000 sailors and airmen. Among those lost were the most experienced carrier pilots in the Japanese fleet, men who had been trained for years before the war began, men Japan could not replace. It was the math that mattered. Without Yorktown, Nimitz would have gone into Midway with 2 carriers against 4. Without Yorktown's air group, Soryu might not have been destroyed in the same 6 minutes as Akagi and Kaga, and Hiryu might not have spent her strike on the wrong ship. Without Yorktown to absorb the Japanese counterattack, Enterprise or Hornet would have taken those bombs and those torpedoes instead. Without Yorktown, Midway might have ended differently. the Pacific might have ended differently. Nimitz never called the decision brave. He never called it heroic. In his quiet office at Pearl Harbor, after the casualty reports came in and the silence of victory settled over his staff, he wrote of the battle in his usual careful prose. He did not single himself out. He thanked the codebreakers and the airmen and the engineers. In private, the men who served under him understood the decision the way Nimitz himself seemed to understand it. Not as courage, not as heroism, as arithmetic, as the only available answer to a problem he had not chosen. Yorktown had not been repaired to survive the war. She had been repaired to survive one battle. And one battle had been enough to break the back of the Japanese Imperial Navy, to halt the Pacific advance that had begun at Pearl Harbor, and to start, in the deep blue water 1,700 miles northwest of Hawaii, the long, slow tide that would carry American ships back to Tokyo Bay. Somewhere on the bottom of the ocean, 3 miles down in the dark, the broken carrier still lies on her side. She did her job.